Welcome, everyone. Tonight, we're once again honored by the presence of Dr. John L. Withers II, who's going to talk about the remarkable and largely unknown experience of the Jews in Albania during World War II. Dr. Withers holds a bachelor's degree from Harvard, a PhD from Yale, and has served in a number of senior positions in the State Department, both stateside and all around the world, with his last posting before retirement being U.S. Ambassador to Albania during the Bush 43 and Obama administrations. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Withers.
It really is a privilege to be here, and I'm flattered and amazed that you would come out on a night like this to to listen to my few words. I'd like to begin by offering some thanks, certainly to Beth Emeth Synagogue for the privilege of being able to speak to you. I would also like to express thanks to someone who can't be here. I'd like to say a word of thanks to Johanna Newman, who was one of the survivors of the Albanian time during the Holocaust, and who I had the honor of meeting, and who really personalized the situation that Jews in Albania faced during those remarkable years. I can't say thanks directly to her, but Lynn, one of her relatives, is here, and I believe her granddaughter is listening on Zoom, and maybe they will accept my thanks on Johanna's behalf. And finally, I would like to say thanks to a remarkable gentleman that fate and Zoom and coincidence has allowed me to meet, and that's Dave Schreiber. He did everything to pull together my previous Zoom talk on the book that I did about my father, and now he has followed up with this. He's been just an organizer par excellence, a supporter, and now a dear friend. So I want to tell you a story about a country that, for various reasons, is rather obscure, and that is Albania. I don't understand why it would be, except that Albania was one of the last of the European countries to be under the rule of the Ottoman Turks. And that has, in some odd way, placed it in a separate category that, again, I really don't understand. Even though, as we can see, could you go back to the earlier slide? Okay. If you think we can do, here we are. So here is Albania. It's marked in green here. And as you can see, it's right across the sea from Italy. It borders Greece, Macedonia. Now Kosovo is in here, Serb, Montenegro. And yet it has always had this sense of being somehow removed, somehow isolated. And now if we could go on to the next one, the map of Albania itself. Again, what I just wanted to show you was a bit of the geography. The whole northern part is extremely mountainous. It really, the south, where you get into into the valleys and so on. But what this geography does is it tells us a little bit about the country. Albania is about 11,000 square miles, which is slightly smaller than the state of Maryland. Albania has roughly 3 million people. Maryland, somewhere around 6. But the similarities end there, because while Maryland is a reasonably prosperous state, and I don't say that simply because I live in Maryland, Albania is probably one of the poorest countries in Europe. Take just a couple of quick numbers. The per capita GDP of the average Marylander is something like $70,000 a year. The per capita GDP of the average Albanian is around $17,000 a year. The GDP of Albania, 49 billion. Maryland's at least 8 times that amount. And I say that because that is going to be the setting of the story that will eventually follow. This is a poor nation. And yet, when I was there, and in terms of my dealings with the Albanians, not morally poor, and not poor in the talent of its people. Let me give you a couple of quick examples. All right. Take Albanian Americans. Now, I think probably 60,000 Albanian Americans living here. But one, William Gregory, was a NASA pilot and captained the space shuttle for many years, and indeed set the duration record for being in space during his time. And he always carried a little Albanian flag when he went up. You have congressmen who are Albanian Americans. Joe, I think I'm pronouncing his name right, Diogardi, long-term Democratic congressman from New York. You had Farid Murad. Any of you ever heard of Farid Murad? Well, he was a Nobel Prize winner. One of two, Mother Teresa being the other. And you may not have heard of him, but he's played a pretty important role in American and world society, because it was on the basis of his scientific discoveries that Pfizer created the pill known as Viagra. John and Jim Belushi, Albanian Americans. And this sets up a kind of a theme that I want to establish. Talented people, brilliant people, poor country. Now, it wasn't always so. Excuse me, when you look back in history, Albania, for centuries, was in the middle of things. Right? If you look back, during the great wars between Rome and the Hellenistic people, Albania played a crucial role. You may have heard of the term a Pyrrhic victory. A Pyrrhic victory is when the victory comes at such cost that it's little more than a loss. That phrase comes from the Albanian general. In Greek, he's called Pyrrhus, Pyrrhic. In Albanian, he's called Pyrrho. he defeated the Romans again and again and again. And he was such a brilliant general that Hannibal, who was not poor shakes as a general himself, listed Pyrrho as the second greatest general in history behind Alexander the Great. The great road, the Via Egnatia, ran through Albania. And the Via Egnatia, which traces, remains straight through Albania, it was the road that connected Rome and Constantinople. And it was universities and all kinds of institutions sprang up in Albania because of the commerce and the traffic along this road. Indeed, Octavian, who later became the Emperor Augustus of the Roman Empire, was in Albania studying when he received word that his uncle Julius Caesar had been assassinated. And he immediately took off for Rome to become the first great emperor of the Caesarian dynasties. Throughout history, people of talent and so on have visited Albania. And I'll just mention two. One was Lord Byron. He went to Albania. There's a famous picture of him in the National Portrait Gallery in London, dressed as an Albanian. And his great poem, Childe Harold, has many, many, many references to his time in Albania. The other was the poet, author, and particularly painter, Edward Lear. And if you heard the poem, The Owl and the Pussycat, that was Edward Lear. But his paintings of Albania are stunning, and you should look them up. And many of them capture the incredible landscape and beauty that, in fact, is Albania. But with all of that, there are really two towering figures in Albanian history. I'll mention them out of order. The one that you're all familiar with is Mother Teresa. Now, Mother Teresa is Albanian, even though she wasn't born in Albania. If you look here at all of these places around Albania, there are very large Albanian communities, right? Macedonia, Northern Macedonia as it's now called, maybe 500,000 Albanians. Greece, down here, at least the same number, 400,000 in Italy. And of course, Kosovo, which is now an independent country, about 1.6 million people is their population, 90% of them Albanian. Why they're not all together as one is a whole other story that I won't bore you with now. But Mother Teresa, even though born in Northern Macedonia, is really one of the stellar Albanians just admired all over, and her determination to take her Sisters of Charity to India, to the worst possible circumstances in the slums of Calcutta, and to help the poorest of the poor, has made her a worldwide figure, a Nobel Prize winner, eventually canonized by the church in the year 2016. The other figure, the other historic figure, less well known to you, but he was a towering figure throughout much of history. And he goes by the name/title Skanderbeg. And Skanderbeg was a 15th century warrior diplomat. He lived during the age of the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, which originated in Turkey. And during this period of time, the Turks moved out. The Ottomans moved out in all different directions, and for a great many years put Europe under threat. One of the key figures in thwarting that Turkish advance was Skanderbeg. And with his light cavalry in the Albanian mountains, he fought the Turks for 25 years, blunted the advance, probably saved Italy, and was absolutely revered. He is the great figure of Albanian history, and during much of history was extremely well known. I don't know why his image has faded. Longfellow wrote a poem about him. Vivaldi wrote an opera about him. Napoleon considered him one of the great modern generals. So he was really, truly an incredible figure. He joined the Albanian tribes into this formidable force. And as I say, kept the Turks at bay for 25 years until his death, at which point the alliance fell apart, and indeed Albania came under the rule of the Ottomans for 400 years. But Europe was saved. Now, let's skip a few years to 1912. In 1912, finally, the Albanians rose in revolt and established their independence. They had but very, very few years to enjoy it. Like many new countries of the time, very, very shaky politics, and they were in no position to resist when in 1941, with the coming of World War II, the Italians invaded and occupied the country. Now, the Italians had their own sets of problems, but one of the key things about their occupation was that the Italians were not fixated on the final solution. And so during their period of time, the Jewish population was largely ignored. That Jewish population kept increasing because as things got worse, and even before the war broke out, as things got worse and worse and worse in Central Europe and particularly in Germany, many Albanians seeking refuge fled to different places, including several thousand to Albania. There is some belief amongst Albanians, which I cannot substantiate, so don't quote me on that it was through Albania that Einstein got out. The royal family of Albania insists that it's true. I cannot find the documents, but nevertheless, there it is. When Italy collapsed in 1943, the Nazis invaded and everything changed. In the Balkan countries, in Albania, just like everywhere else, one of their principal objectives was the abolition of the Jewish population. To me, it is difficult, it's impossible to comprehend how this virulence continued everywhere. So throughout Albania during these times, when the Germans came, there were the selection gatherings that were commanded to take place in the central squares of the Albanian cities. There were dragnets. There were attempts to recruit spies. There were everything to search out the Jewish population for transportation and destruction. But something happened. Something happened that no one, and certainly not the Nazis, were prepared for. And because of what happened, a sort of social miracle, moral miracle, I think we can raise a question, which I will get back to later on in my speech. What if the world in those dark days had been Albania? Because what happened was that again and again and again, the Albanians protected their Jewish friends. And remember, they had no army, they had no government, they had no effective organizations to try to coordinate this. It was Albanian after Albanian after Albanian. They would bring Jewish families into their homes. They would adopt them. If necessary, they would dress them as Albanians, Albanian peasants, give them a hoe. They would move them from village to village. They would hide them in the forest. But again and again and again, this happened. So at a time when in the rest of Europe, if you were Jewish, your chances of survival were what? Yeah, one in 10 if you were lucky. Unless you lived in Albania, when your chances of survival proved to be very nearly 100%. Right? And let me give you just a sense or two of what it was like. Let me quote one or two of these stories. And this one is from the family Pashkai. The father, Pashkai, was the owner of a general store. And his son, recalling the incident long after his father had passed away, wrote this: "One day, a German transport rolled by with 19 Albanian prisoners on their way to hard labor and one Jew to be shot. My father invited the Nazis into his store and offered them food and wine. He plied them with wine until they became drunk. Meanwhile, he hid a note in a piece of melon and gave it to the young Jew. He instructed him to jump out of the truck and flee to the woods to a designated place. The Nazis were furious over the escape, but my father claimed innocence. They lined him up against a wall to extract information about where the Jew was hiding. 4 times they put a gun to his head. They came back and threatened to burn the entire village if my father did not confess. He held out, and finally they left. My father retrieved the man from the forest and hid him for 2 years in his home until the war was over." Right? Let me read you another from the family Pogu. Now remember, one thing that is interesting about this, I'll talk a little bit more about it, but technically, the majority of Albanians during that period of time, and even now, profess to be Muslim. And yet, here were the kinds of things that they were doing. the family Pogum. Now, he was a wealthy man, lived in a port city, and his wife wrote about him. My husband hid Jews in and around Shkodër, the port city, and he organized other hiding places. He secretly drove Jewish families to our country home, high in the mountains. He also arranged for families to travel across the sea by ferry to safety in an Allied occupied territory in Italy. Many of my husband's activities in saving Jews were well known to our employees, and many of them helped in these rescues. My husband helped so many, I cannot remember all their names. Let me read you an account of Johanna Newman, account of her, in which she said, her name, of course, at that time was, her family name was Gerechter. She was interesting. She arrived in Albania long before the war. She arrived in 1939, so she had been there for some time. The Gerechters remained in Albania, fleeing from one town to another, staying one step ahead of the Nazis, who occupied Albania in the summer of 1943. The last family that sheltered them, the Pilkus, she remembered with great fondness. They had a son, Edip, who was about Johanna's age, roughly 9 years old, and they became like brother and sister. For an observant family, life in Albania, a predominantly Muslim country, was a revelation for the Gechters. This is what Johanna said. We heard the Mezuin call the faithful to prayer 5 times a day. And that sound is so familiar to me that when in this day and age I hear it, it is heartening to hear it again. And these were the kinds of bonds that were created between those who were rescued and those who were did the rescuing. There stands in Albania today a Holocaust memorial. When I was there, I had the privilege to meet a gentleman by the name of Warren Miller, who was working at the White House at the time. He was the chairman of the Commission for the Preservation of America's Heritage Abroad. And he was captured by this story, and he put together the components that were needed to try to get the Albanians to build a Holocaust monument. For Albanians, this didn't make any sense. They didn't consider what they had done particularly important or unusual. So even though I left Albania in 2010, I did everything that I could as the ambassador there to try to move the project along. The Albanians just sort of shrugged it off, and it was only in 2019 that the memorial was built. It stands there in a nice place in the Central Park of Tirana. And one of the reasons that I must get back to Albania soon is to see that monument. It is one, I would believe, of the very, very few Holocaust memorials dedicated to the people who lived and not to the people who died. So I think that the question that you can ask coming out of all of this is, why? Why did this poor, poor people who had nothing to gain by taking on the might of Nazi Germany, why did they do this? Why did they risk so much for these people who were essentially strangers to them? And there are any number of speculations about this. One of them was by the American ambassador, one of the early American ambassadors to Albania, who in point of fact was Jewish. His name was Herman Bernstein. And he discovered, again, this amazing quality in the Albanians. He was there 1930 to 1933. And this is what he discovered. He said, there is no trace of any discrimination against Jews in Albania because Albania happens to be one of those rare lands where religious prejudice does not exist. Now, when I was there, you could feel that. There were four great religions, four traditional religions in Albania of that time. All right, one were the Sufi Muslims. One was an interesting reformist sect of Muslims, the Bektashi. One were the Orthodox Christians, like the Greek Orthodox, and the last were the Catholics. And when I was there, you were constantly seeing the interaction amongst these groups, and in a certain way, it kind of brought you up short. So for example, on the Catholic holidays, all of the chief religious figures of the other groups would come and offer their congratulations to the group that was celebrating. And this was just the way it was. It was accepted. It wasn't forced upon anyone. When in the port city of Shkodra, after communism fell, and the Catholic cathedral was returned to the church, it was in very poor shape. The communists had turned it into a stable for horses. But everyone cooperated. So the Muslim community gave resources and labor to renovate the Catholic Church. And this happened all of the time and in all of these different ways. One of the stories that I first heard when I arrived, I was at a museum, and the guide who was taking me around, very, very jovial man, and he said, "This is a great day for me. My son is getting married." I said, "Congratulations, that's wonderful." And he said, "Yes." He said, it's an interreligious marriage, and they're deeply in love, and it's going to be terrific. And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Oh, yeah. He said, "My only problem is I can't remember if my son is the Christian and the young lady Muslim, or is it the other way around? I don't know." Right? And the more you dug into this, the more that you recognized that there was something to it. Can I show the third slide? Okay, this is an 18th century icon. And you look at it initially, and you immediately see, aha, Orthodox Christianity, the well of health and well-being. The Madonna, the child, very much in the Byzantine tradition. But look behind those figures, and you'll see mosques, you'll see cathedrals, you'll see churches. Right? This icon, even though glorifying the Orthodox tradition, respects the religious beliefs of these other faiths. 18th century. And so this is what you encountered when you get to Albania, and even now, you can see it and you can sense it. So was religious tolerance behind all of this? Yes, to some degree. To some degree. I think it clearly was. But I think also that there was something else. And I'll have to try to explain this, because it's a little bit of a different concept. The Albanians have a word that describes their moral code, and that word is besa. People have, and people live up to, their besa. And it's hard to explain what that means. It's hard to translate it. It's honor, it's a promise, it's trust, it's humaneness, it's all of these things in some kind of combination that creates this sense of caring. And let me read you a quote that comes as close to capturing this feeling, this besa, as any that I've encountered. All right, this was from the family Vesely. The Vesely family was the first Albanian family to be declared righteous Gentiles at Yad Vashem. And this was what was written. When my husband was asked how it was possible that so many Albanians hid Jews and protected them, he said, it's because there are no foreigners in Albania, only guests. Our moral code, our besa, as Albanians, requires that we be hospitable to guests in our home and in our country. When asked about the possibility of Albanians reporting the presence of Jews to the Germans, my husband said if an Albanian did this, he would disgrace his village and his family. That's as close to besa as I can explain it. The feeling of those rescued, I think, was summarized in another quote. This is by a woman named Irene Greenbaum, who left Albania after the war and went to Israel. And she wrote in her autobiography, "Farewell, Albania. One day I will tell the world how brave, fearless, strong, and faithful your sons are. How death and the devil can't frighten them. The gates of your country remained open to Albania. Your authorities closed their eyes when necessary to give poor, persecuted people another chance to survive. The most horrible of all wars. Albania, we survived the siege because of your humanity. We thank you." So I think then let me end with the question that I raised before. What if the world had been Albania? What if the powerful countries, with their strong governments and their institutions and their richness and so on, had reflected something that these poor people carried out at such enormous risks to themselves? Think of the millions of happy lives that would have been lived. Think of all of the laughter of children. Think of the joy of celebration. All of the achievements in every field, science, literature, culture, so many more. Think of family gatherings. Think of children at play. Think of all of the things that we as humans do normally and take comfort in and allow to structure good lives for ourselves and for our families? And what of the moral elevation of humanity if the world in that day had been Albania? Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to attempt to answer. Yes.
When the Germans came in, how did the Albanians, and I'm sure that they were trying to look for Jews, how did the Albanians respond, and how did that work out?
You mean, was there Albanian resistance against the German attack, or?
Well, I mean, when Germans would go into other countries, and they would, they would question the people living there and then find the Jews. So what kept the Germans from finding Jews in Albania?
The Albanians simply refused to cooperate. All right. There were of course instances of people who told, and there were instances of people who didn't want to be involved. But again and again and again, people who knew that that family was hiding a Jewish family kept silent and wouldn't reveal that to the Germans. There are so many stories. I can't remember the name of the man in the family, but he heard one of his friends, and this was happening a lot, one of his friends reported that someone had told that he was hiding a Jewish family. All right, he said, they're going to be here any minute. You've got to do something. You have been exposed. And so the man said, oh my God. And the only thing he could think of was to hide the Jewish family in the attic of his home. And of course, the head of the Jewish family was very nervous. He'd heard that the Germans would often just burn homes, and if they were in the attic, they were trapped. They would die. And the Albanian said to him, I don't have any alternative. They're going to be here. That's all I've got to hide you. But to show you my good faith, my eldest son, the man who will inherit my property and my goods, will hide in that attic with you. And if you die, he will die with you. Right? Again and again and again, you have these kinds of stories, and how they kept secrets. One thing that they certainly did was they constantly moved these people. And they would move them. I think Johanna Newman moved 6 times to try to avoid the persecution. It's a very good question, and I don't know that I have a firm answer, but it worked. Somehow it worked. Yes.
What is your sense today of Albania and, the population of Jews? And it's mostly a Muslim country now. So what is that like today?
Well, the first thing is I would be a little bit careful about saying Albania is a Muslim country. Because in the sense that we normally mean a Muslim country, That isn't Albania, all right? There's no element of the theocratic or anything like that. And most of the, a great many of the people are, they're not strict religionists. So even though they would say again, the largest group, about 50% of the population, say that they're Muslim, they're very, very open and very, very tolerant. Okay? And I would point out one thing, that again, in this Muslim country, the two most revered figures, Mother Teresa and Skanderbeg, are Catholic. And yet everywhere you go, it doesn't matter where you are, the little figurines of those two figures are there. Now, in terms of today, I think I would guess that it's more and more and more, there's a kind of a secularization that comes in as Albania modernizes and westernizes and so on. Very, very, I heard of some tensions up in the north with Catholics and Muslims, but nothing compared to what we consider tensions. I'm terrible but with names. But in France, when there was the assassination of Charlie Hebdo, look it up. World leaders all gathered to march in the great parade supporting, right? And there in that parade, the leaders of the 4 traditional churches of Albania walked arm in arm. So there is this, I don't know if you want to call it tolerance, I don't know if you want to call it acceptance, but there is this sense of religion in its place, but let me give you one other example. I mentioned this sect called the Bektashi. Now, the Bektashi, the world headquarters of the Bektashi faith, is in fact in Tirana, the capital of Albania. But they declare themselves Muslim, Shiite, but they have no problem presenting portraits or statues or so on of the prophet. They have a very egalitarian and open sense of women and their role and how they can dress and so on. But the most remarkable thing to me about the Bektashi is that they believe, even though they have particularistic views, they still believe that any religious institution has sanctity. So if a Bektashi is somewhere and has a feeling of a need to pray, and the closest place is the synagogue, that's where the Bektashi prays, or the mosque, or whatever. So there's a, and by the way, the Bektashi were very, very strong in protecting the Jewish community. The story is, he's no longer living, but the last head of the Bektashi church, who was there when I was still serving there, was very much alive during World War II as a young person. And when the Germans demanded the documents showing the Jewish residents of Albania, it so happened that the Albanian, I can't call him quite a puppet, but the Albanian authority in charge of that list was Bektashi. And the word got to him, that he should refuse to give them the list, and that's what he did. So I know I'm struggling a bit to, but I have told the Albanians again and again and again, I don't know what your attitudes are, but bottle it and sell it, please. Right? You can cure your economic woes, and you can bring a lot of good to the world, just little tiny bottles of it for the rest of us.
While I've listened to you, I get the feeling that sometimes greed and this desire for easy wealth can breed hatred and terrible things in this world. And you've described a people who are very humble and don't have necessarily those kinds of desires. Their desires are for things that are much more simple in life. I did not know about Albania and the Jews. I heard about other countries that were kind to Jews in the war, but I've never heard about Albania. Do you feel, and again, knowing what a humble people these are, that they have gotten the proper recognition from the world Jewish community for what they have done for all of us?
That's a difficult question. I'm not sure I'm the person to ask. Yeah, it's never stopped me from talking before. What I would say is that probably more so than most other people, the Israelis have recognized the Albanians to a greater degree. So, for example, this monument that I mentioned, it's these 3 beautiful tablets almost, and one is in Albanian, one is in English, and one is in Hebrew. And the Israeli ambassador was there and gave great words. I think proportionally, and I think this is right, proportionally, more Albanians have been declared righteous Gentiles than any other population. That doesn't mean that the most numerically are Albanian, but proportionally, I think that is correct. A great many of the Jewish survivors of the war then went on to Israel, and I think the Jewish population of Albania right now is really very small. But the chief interpreter for the president of the country is a young Jewish man, a friend of mine, and very insightful, the different things that were there. Yes.
Can you provide some data on what the percentage of the population of Albania was in terms of numbers and percentage before the war, subsequent to the war, and today? Jews, right.
Well, it's interesting you should say that. The Prime Minister of Albania made the point, substantiated by, Yad Vashem and so on. Albania is the only country in the world where the Jewish population increased during the only one. And as I say, after the war, many people moved on. The call of Israel was very strong. So yeah, it was, all of that was particularly special. Historically, there's plenty of evidence that there were Jewish communities there. For example, there's a beautiful port beach city in the south called Saranda, And in doing the archaeology of the city below the floor of a Christian church, they unearthed a mosaic of a menorah. Beautifully done there. When I was there, they were working to get money to make sure that it was preserved. And when you go to cities like Elbasan, which was a great crossroads during the Roman times, you're going through the museums there and you're looking, and suddenly you see utensils and they have the Star of David and so on. So there was a Jewish presence. Now, how large it was, I really can't say. I don't know. Yes, please.
Behalf of my daughter on Zoom. She is Adriana Newman, the granddaughter of Johanna Newman. And she just wants to, publicly thank you for sharing your story and including Johanna. But she also wanted to say that it was, she called Johanna Oma, it's her grandmother. She said that it was so important to her Oma that the story be shared, because Muslim, the most of the population were Muslim, and it was so important to them, to their religious, that the differences between humans was not important. What was important was to help anybody in need.
I think that's a very good point. What is her name? Hello, Adriana. I appreciate your comments. Yes, please.
It's just interesting because large groups of people morally are not always as the Albanians are. And it's so unique for so many people to have acted in a moral way, especially when it comes to religion, which can more frequently rip you apart. Why has there been studies done to understand why this group of people have been able to actually live together peacefully when most of the world can't?
Okay, well, I've got to back up a little bit. I don't want to give you the impression of a nation of saints. What makes the story of Albania so compelling to me, I mean, if they were saints, then yes, this is what you would expect them to do. You would expect them to behave in this particular way. They were human. And that's what makes it so extraordinary. They had their fears and they had their weaknesses and they had, their rivalries and so on. And Albanians are, like the rest of us, they can be, competitive, and they can, develop deep friendships, and they can develop enmities as well. But it is these very human characteristics that I think makes the story extraordinary. Because like these human stories, when you hear them and when you talk to the people, when I was there, I used to host lunches for the rescued and the rescuers and talk and hear their stories. And the question that you asked was the question that I constantly ask: why? Why? And I never got a good answer to that, except that something pretty close to, well, in Albanian terms, it was the right thing to do. That was about as much as they got. And so again, you would go and you would talk to these people, and again, there was not this sense of, we need to advertise this, we need to do this, we need to do. No. It was all just, well, we did it, but in our view, that's what everybody should do. And when you'd say, but everybody didn't do it, and they would say, well, they should have. It was never, what I'm saying is there was never a sense of that clear response that explained everything. It was left in this amazing, almost mysterious zone. Again, I can tell you again, unusual stories. The current prime minister of Albania is a man named Edi Rama. And he grew up as an artist. He was very much a part of the world of painting and literature, and intellectual, and and so on. And again, you would go around and each of these ceremonies, Idul Fitr, or the day of the Ascension, or whatever it was, and you'd bump into Edi Rama. He was not the prime minister at that time. He was still the leader of the opposition. And he would sit and he would tell you stories. And one of the stories that he told, again, related to religion. And that was that there were various relatives of his who were various faiths. The Orthodox, and I think there might have been a Muslim and a Catholic, and so on. And when he was about to be born, they began to kind of maneuver to see whether or not they could make him a member of this faith or that. And I think, I don't want to misquote him, but one of the others felt that we're in there early. The child has just been born and he's going to be one of our faith. And they got there and discovered that no, in fact, the Catholics had gotten there first. And when I heard that when Pope Francis visited Albania some years ago, that he got a great kick out of it when Rama told him that story. But it's a remarkable country. And I get back to my earlier theme, and that is poverty, but not moral poverty. Yes.
It seems like what Robin was talking about is that these people were not competing for wealth. I mean, wealth is a wonderful thing, and it's a terrible thing because people want it and they desire it and they fight very hard for it. And so these people fought for life, to live, and they supported one another. They were a community. Even though they were a country, they were a community. And so even there were differences in the community, and that's how life was. And they all supported one another. And so it wasn't a big deal for them. I mean, it's remarkable.
They can compete. They can compete for wealth. I regret to say that there's a great deal of corruption in the country, and so on. They're people, and they go about the business of being people. But at certain instances, they seem to rise and to do something. So, for example, and again, maybe Mary Ruth can help me out with this, but right now in Albania, there's an interesting situation, and that is that when we left Afghanistan, and in the mad scramble to evacuate people, a number of people who couldn't get into the United States or Britain and so the Albanians took them. And the Albanians have housed them and accepted them and so on. And when the people are concerned and so on about being able to move on to these other countries, the Albanians have said to them, if you wish, just stay here with us. So there is at those moments, all right, there is that ability to transcend. And I think maybe that's probably true of many people. I would even hope most people. But it's remarkable that at what I would consider the greatest crisis of that century, that was when they chose to step forward. And they did it in such, again, I struggle with this. Okay, there were different partisan groups there that were trying to, to fight the Germans and, and so on. But it wasn't as though you had an Albanian army, an Albanian government, an Albanian territory where they could provide a true refuge for these places. It was primarily individual Albanians again and again and again doing these things. And that tells me that it's something more than institutions and organizations and so on. It's something, it's something really more. You can ask the question. In fact, I think the Israeli ambassador asked it at the memorial ceremony. Other stronger, richer countries were not able somehow to resist in the same way that the Albanians did. I'm not saying that there were not any number of instances of Poles or Dutch or Latvians or whatever who took the risk to try to help this. I'm not saying that. But I don't know, I think the Danes evacuated their Jewish populations. And I think the Serbs and the Bulgarians did what they could. But I don't know of any other instance in which small country, admittedly, comparatively small Jewish population, yes, but who had this universal sense that these people needed Albanian assistance and assisted. All right, I didn't write down a particular quote, but I thought was very powerful, and that is one Albanian head of household, when the Jewish family arrived at his home, he said to them, "We're now one family. And what happens to you happens to us. And I promise you that my sons and I will fight to protect you from any peril that you might face." Well, I sit there, I listen to these people, I put myself in their position, because again, it is such a human level that you can identify with. I put myself in their position and I ask, would I do it? Would I have the courage? Would I have the tenacity? Because once you got started on this, you had to see it out. Would I have any of those things? And I would like to say, oh yeah, I'd do that. Say definitively that I would. But any other things that well, thank you. You've been a very patient audience.
No, I just want to thank you, Dr. Withers, for a fascinating and uplifting presentation. Thank you all for coming and for tuning in from home. I just want to give you a preview. Our next presentation is going to be on Tuesday, December 13th, 7:30. Our very own Rabbi Warner is going to be talking, and he's going to be talking about miracles in the time of the Torah and the time of today. So I hope we will all see you then. And again, thank you.
You're most welcome.